All right. Program or be programmed. 10 Commands for a Digital Age. Douglas Rushkoff. Final chapter here, chapter 10, purpose. Program or be programmed. Digital technology is programmed. This makes it biased toward those with the capacity to write the code. In a digital age, we must learn how to make the software or risk becoming the software. It is not too difficult or too late to learn the code behind the things we use, or at least to understand that there is code behind their interfaces. Otherwise, we are at the mercy of those who do the programming, the people paying them, or even the technology itself. And he begins by talking about, an Air Force general tasked with protecting the global information grid. And he has a problem: recruitment. As the person in charge of the Air Force's coolest computer technologies, he doesn't have problem getting kids that want to fly drones or shoot lasers from satellites or steer missiles. But the challenge is finding kids capable of programming these weapons, or even having the education, inclination, and mental discipline required to begin learning programming from scratch. And so this new wave of recruits, kids that grew up on commercial video games, right? They're very familiar and impressively good. Their hand-eye coordination, their, familiarity with using software and these programs, they're impressive in doing these things, but they're not interested in learning the programming of those things. They just want to use the platforms and those tools and gadgets and the software. But so the problem is that they don't have anyone to program or fix bugs or ensure that everything is working properly. They don't have enough people willing to sign up for that piece of it. So he says, that's right. America, the country that once put men on the moon, is now falling behind most developed and many developing nations in computer education. We do not teach programming in most public schools. Instead of teaching programming, most schools with computer literacy curriculums teach programs. Kids learn how to use popular spreadsheet, word processing, and browsing software so that they can operate effectively in the high-tech workplace. These basic skills may make them more employable for the entry-level cubicle jobs of today, but they will not help them adapt to the technologies of tomorrow. The bigger problem is that their entire orientation to computing will be from the perspective of users. When a kid is taught a piece of software as a subject, they'll tend to think of it like any other thing they have to learn. Success means learning how to behave in the way the program needs them to. Digital technology becomes the immutable thing, while the student is the movable part, conforming to the needs of the program in order to get a good grade on the test. And that's huge. And it's a huge point of broadly an issue that I have with education today. And I think, arguably it goes back further than this, but the thing that broke education was No Child Left Behind. Teaching to tests, standardizing curriculum, all of that stuff just ruined education and turned students into these drones seeking good grades so that they can get a good corporate job, right? Or go to college to get the job. Education is not education today. It's indoctrination into being good employees. But importantly, and an interesting distinction here is it would be the equivalent here, an equivalent would be teaching kids how to read but not how to write. So think about what that would mean if you were in an English class and all they did was taught you how to read books but never how to write. You never wrote essays or anything like that. Think about what that would mean and what that learning process would do to your outlook going forward. You could only read content, but you could never write back, or you could not write something of your own. And how limiting that would be The irony of it, and the same thing here, is like the two go hand in hand. So it's not hard to teach writing at the same time as teaching reading. So that's the thing. So the dynamic that you create is you can only consume the reading materials, but you can never create it yourself. And so we're creating that's the dynamic that we're creating on every level, but in computers as well. We're not creating people who can create the programs. And all over the world, from China to Iran, they aren't wasting their time learning how to use off-the-shelf commercial software packages. They're finding out how computers work. They learn computer languages. They write software. And some of them are even taught cryptography and other skills they need to breach Western cybersecurity measures. And according to the Air Force General, it's just a matter of a generation before they've surpassed us. And while military superiority might not be everyone's foremost goal, it can serve as a good indicator of our general competitiveness culturally and economically with the rest of the world. As we lose the ability to program the world's computers, we lose the world's computing business as well. But we see actual coding as some boring chore, a working class skill like bricklaying, which may as well be outsourced to some poor nation while our kids play and even design video games. We look at developing the plots and characters for a game as the interesting part, and the programming as the rote task better offloaded to people somewhere else. We lose sight of the fact that the programming, the code itself, is the place from which the most significant innovations emerge. Okay, so you say, so why don't we just make sure there are a few students interested in this highly specialized area of coding so that we can keep up militarily and economically with everyone else? Just because a few of us need to know how to program, surely that doesn't mean we all need to know programming, does it? We all know how to drive our cars, yet few of us know how our automobiles actually work, right? True enough, but look where that's gotten to us, specifically looking at the automobile argument there. We spend an hour or two of what used to be free time operating a dangerous 2-ton machine, and on average a full workday each week paying to own and maintain it. So he's talking about an hour or two of what used to be free time, that means commuting, operating this dangerous heavy machinery, and then we spend the equivalent of a full workday in pay each week just to pay to own it and maintain it. So paying off the loan that it took to get it, paying for the gas, paying for the maintenance, oil changes, and any other work that needs to be done. And throughout the 20th century, we remained blissfully ignorant of the real biases of automotive transportation. We approached our cars as consumers through ads rather than as engineers, or better, civic planners. We gladly surrendered our public streetcars to private automobiles, unaware of the real expenses involved. And so, again, to reframe this, he's using the automobile example as a case study for exactly the type of dynamic that we've created in computers. We allow the creators of these tools to dictate to us how we should engage with it, and then we just accept it as a standard rather than doing the work to become informed on the tools themselves. And so we'll go on here, and it should become clear exactly what it is, the point that we're talking about. We surrendered our highway policy to a former General Motors chief who became Secretary of Defense primarily for the purpose of making public roads suitable for private cars and spending public money on a highway system. We surrendered city and town life for the commuting suburbs, unaware that the bias of the automobile was to separate home from work. As a result, we couldn't see that our national landscape was being altered to manufacture dependence on the automobile. We also missed the possibility that these vehicles could make the Earth's atmosphere unfit for human life, or that we would one day be fighting wars primarily to maintain the flow of oil required to keep them running. So considering the biases of a technology before and during its implementation may not be so trivial after all. In the case of digital technology, it is even more important than usual. The automobile determined a whole lot about how we'd get from place to place, as well as how we would reorganize our physical environment to promote its use. Digital technology doesn't merely convey our bodies, but ourselves. Our screens are the windows through which we are experiencing, organizing, and interpreting the world in which we live. So, if we don't know how they work, we have no way of knowing what is really out there. We cannot truly communicate because we have no idea how the media we are using bias the messages we are sending and receiving. Our senses and our thoughts are already clouded by our own misconceptions, prejudices, and confusion. Our digital tools add yet another layer of bias on top of that. Programming is the sweet spot, the high leverage point in a digital society. If we don't learn to program, we risk If we don't learn to program, we risk being programmed ourselves. And I'll pause there, taking it back and trying to make sure that I drive this home. The whole issue with automobiles, right? We think about people take for granted cars today and what they've done. It's just so ingrained in our lives that you don't really consider it or what the alternatives could have been. But as an alternative, we could have had pedestrian-centric cities and towns. We didn't need thousands of miles of highway tearing up our nature. We could have had high-speed rail systems. We could have had these community resources available to all individuals that made, I think the promise of the automobile was just the individual's ability to travel. That's great, but making it the priority that it has been is odd. And more importantly, was the structure and dynamics of everything around this, making it this priority. We wanted that to be the case, but at the same time, right, we wanted this individual freedom to travel on our own terms and whatever. That's great, but at the same time, there was an almost conscious effort to, make it unapproachable for people to become the engineers or mechanics of those vehicles. They had to outsource that, and so they become dependent on a mechanic, right? And we built our entire social structures, our cities, our towns, our highway systems, our states are all designed around the automobile, which fundamentally have a bias of separating work from home. And so now work is something you go and do and then come back to. Community things are something that you go to and come back to your home, instead of having this kind of blending of culture. And so we've created that dynamic, making it the priority, and making everybody extremely dependent on that system, and then taking away their tools or ability to have autonomy in that whole thing. You can't make your own car, right? And you can't start a car manufacturing business because the barriers to entry are so insane. These cars have gotten so complex and you don't have easy access to the information. You're never taught how to maintain a car. For something so central to our lives, why wouldn't that be part of an education curriculum? So we've designed a system where we're completely dependent on this thing, and then we're also completely dependent on external authorities to ensure that we can maintain this thing. So the irony here is that computers are frighteningly easy to learn. Programming is immensely powerful, but is really no big deal to learn. And in the 70s, when computers were supposedly harder to use, there was no difference between operating a computer and programming one. Better public schools offered computer classes starting in the 6th or 7th grade, usually as an elective in the math department. You would learn, they were blank slates. You wrote crude applications, teaching the computer to list prime numbers, draw pictures with text, or as in his final project, decide how to prioritize the decisions of an elevator car. But the point there is, it is that simple, right? They were doing this, it was 6th or 7th grade. Computers were supposedly harder to use at that time, right? But a middle schooler has the capability to know how to do the programming. And once you learn or understand code, the whole world reveals itself as a series of decisions made by coders. I'm inserting the word coders there, but by planners and designers for how the rest of us should live. Not just computers, but everything from the way streets are organized in a town to the way election rules are tilted for a purpose vote for any 3 candidates begin to look like what they are: sets of rules developed to promote certain outcomes. Once these biases become apparent, anything becomes possible. The world and its many arbitrary systems can be hacked. And then he goes on to say this part was really interesting. Just like the automobile thing that I was trying to so hard to express right there, the people investing in software and hardware development wanted to discourage hackers by making their interfaces more complex. And so the idea was to turn a highly transparent medium of computing into a more opaque one, like television. Interfaces got thicker and more supposedly user-friendly, while the real workings of the machine got buried further in the background. So even things like the wizard, the support wizard, was, that replaced the helper, the puppy, and even the paperclip man. They had to remystify the simple tasks that the systems were doing, right? They were trying to make, the operations seem more unattainably complex. And they did all this, basically, these developers created these barriers to getting behind the scenes to prevent hacking and all that stuff. And they, basically people were told not to look behind the curtains, and it was supposed to be safer that way. And we bought into this false premise that the more open a device was, the more open it was to every bad person out there. And it's better to buy a locked down and locked up device and then just trust the company we bought it from to take care of us. That's exactly what's going on. Heaven forbid they trust an unauthorized vendor, or worse, try to do something themselves. They must do everything through the centralized applications program, through the exclusive carrier, and not try to alter any of it. The accepted logic is that these closed technologies and systems are safer and more dependable. And he goes on to say, of course, none of this is really true. Fully open and customizable operating systems like Linux are much more secure than closed ones. In fact, the backdoor that commercial operating systems leave for potential vendors and consumer research have made them more vulnerable to attack than their open source counterparts. This threat is compounded by the way commercial vendors keep their source code a secret. We aren't even to know the ways we are vulnerable. We are but to trust. Even the Pentagon is discouraged from developing its own security protocols through the Linux platform by a Congress heavily lobbied to promote Windows. And so that's the point, is we're expected to become completely dependent on these platforms. And then they're going to prevent us from having the autonomy to work and provide security measures or even understand where we are vulnerable, right? So they lock down the access to the backdoors or vendor protocols that leave us exposed. We're not able to publicly know that information. And so we're dependent on this central authority, and then we're expected to just trust them to protect us. That's bad. That's really bad. And it's been shown, and this is a great example, the vendor avenue, that piece, that is exactly Target, all of these major hacks that have happened are because of these vendor backdoor things. And it really exposes everybody else to the harmful consequences of that. But we're not allowed to do anything about it. And so we just have to accept this dynamic. And that's such a super big problem. So again, the main problem here, as he alluded to in the introduction, is just like we haven't seized the capability of each media age. We remained one-dimensional leap behind the technology on offer. Before text, only the Pharaoh could hear the words of God. After text, the people could gather in the town square and hear the word of God read to them by a rabbi, but only the rabbi could read the scroll. So people always remain one stage behind their elite. Printing press helped a lot of people learn to read, but only an elite with access to the presses had the ability to write. So we finally have the tools to program, yet we are content to seize only the capability of the last great media renaissance, that of writing. We feel proud to build a web page, but we remain unaware of the biases of the program in which we are participating, as well as the ways they circumscribe our newfound authorship within their predetermined agendas. We become dependent on search engines and smartphones developed by companies we can only hope value our productivity over their bottom line. We learn to socialize and make friends through interfaces and networks that may be more dedicated to finding a valid advertising model than helping us find one another. We've surrendered the unfolding of a new technological age to a small elite who have seized the capability on offer. But while Renaissance kings maintained their monopoly over the printing presses by force, today's elite is depending on little more than our own disinterest. We're too busy wading through our overflowing inboxes to consider how they got this way, and whether there's a better or less frantic way to stay informed and in touch. In the short term, we are looking at a society increasingly dependent on machines, yet decreasingly capable of making or even using them effectively. One thing like idiocracy comes to mind here is just like creating this super dumb, dependent population that just gets so ugly. And some final thoughts here. Futurism is not an exact science, particularly where technology is concerned. In most cases, the real biases of a technology are not even known until that technology has had a chance to exist and replicate for a while. I thought that was really interesting, and again, I like to have that frame. It's something I want to come back to as like, we're not really good. We've never been very good, but particularly lately, at taking anything outside of like our current understanding of things or the way things have been done and placing it into context. And we're not good at recognizing that sometimes the biases of the systems that we put into place, or the outcomes, the unintended consequences, all of these things, you can't know the extent of them until things have been implemented and tested. And with that in mind, if you are implementing things with that in mind, it becomes easier to adjust in the future rather than just accepting that implementation as the right thing to have done. In the long term, if we take up this challenge, we are looking at nothing less than the consciousness we're looking at nothing less than the conscious collective intervention of human beings in their own evolution. It's the opportunity of a civilization's lifetime. Shouldn't more of us want to participate actively in this project? Digital technologies are different. They're not just objects, but systems embedded with purpose. They act with intention. If we don't know how they work, we won't even know what they want. The less involved and aware we are of the way our technologies are programmed and program themselves, the more narrow our choices will become. The less we will be able to envision alternatives to the pathways described by our programs. And the more our lives and experiences will be dictated by their biases. But on the other hand, the more involved humans become, the more humanely inspired these tools will end up behaving. We can influence them. We just have to learn. We have to do the work. So that's a good place to end. Very happy with this book. I am glad that I was able to capture all of this. I'll probably come back in a little bit and do sort of like a summary view and gather my thoughts and talk about all of these things. But that was chapter 10.